This is going to be a quick video showcasing how to animate stuff in Blender. And it's actually quite simple, and I think you'll find it's very intuitive and not too difficult. So, to begin, the most important part for animation is really the timeline itself, which is by default docked here at the bottom. And if you hit the space bar or the play button on the key lineup, you'll notice that the timeline moves. But there's nothing animated currently, so nothing happens. But this is actually the frames that are being animated. And by default, you're capped out at 250 frames, but you can make this any number you want. So if I put this at 100 or 1000, it will change accordingly. And this is independent of frame rate. By default, the frame rate of Blender is set to 24 FPS. And when that is the case, that means that every 24 of these frames, 1 second passes. So for example, if I only have 48 frames, that means this is a 2-second time period. You can change the frame rate to be anything you want, but 24 FPS will be very comfortable for animation actually, so that's where we will stay. You can animate at 30 frames per second, but partially to save on render time and render space and everything, we will do 24 FPS, which is actually very close to what most film is shot at. Some animation will go lower, down to something like 12 or 8, and then if you get lower than 12 though, it starts to really look choppy, stop motion. But for this example, I'm actually going to leave it at 24 FPS, and so I will make a 240 frame length segment here, which will be 10 seconds. And that's not super important, but I think that'll help make some sense of things. Now, to animate, there are many different ways that you can animate different properties. The most straightforward way is to actually just click on an object, and by any of the transform numbers and values, if you click this dot on the right hand side, it will key that property, which will begin the animation process. For example, if I key the X location at 0 at frame 1, and then I jump to frame 240 and I make this 24 meters, and I key it by clicking this diamond, now I have animated the cube moving from frame 1 to 240, 24 meters. You'll notice there is some acceleration. It slowly picks up speed, and then it will also slow to a stop. This can be edited. This is by default the interpolation mode, which is essentially giving the things acceleration, which can be really useful for animation, but for something like this or camera movements, oftentimes we don't want that. So what we can do is select these keyframe diamonds in the timeline, right click, and where it says interpolation mode, you switch it to linear. Now the thing that is animated will move at a constant velocity. So you can go through these different properties and animate any of them. For example, the rotation, we could change, and you can use the gumballs or however you want. You just need to make sure you're keying all of the different components, and you'll see that it will rotate and move as it goes over the frame range. While you could animate everything in this manner, it's actually much easier to do this by, you can go to a slide on the timeline with your object selected, and you can press the I key on the keyboard, and then you can keyframe any of these different values. We'll do this with the scale, for example. Here at frame 1, I will key the scale. I'll just jump over to frame 101, and I will change the scale, and I will press I and keyframe. You can do scale, delta scale, rotation and scale, etc. There's all sorts of different options. I'm just going to do the default scale option, and then I'm going to go to the end. So it would keep this same scale all the way to the end, but now if I set this back to 1, 1, and 1, and then press I and scale again, now it's going to start at this size and end at this size, but in the middle it's going to grow. So I can hit the play button, you'll watch that it grows, and then it's going to shrink back down. And so really quickly now we've created a nice simple animation for our default cube. If you want to start doing things that are a little more interesting and complicated though, it'll be handy to probably subdivide this. So I will actually go into edit mode really quickly, and I'm going to subdivide our cube, not as extremely as I've subdivided other things in the past, but just to get some visual variety, we'll do that many. And I'm going to apply a noise texture displacement. So I'm just going to add a quick noise texture to the Blender scene. I'll do a Voronoi actually, because it's very visual. If you look here, you'll notice that many of these properties are actually keyframeable. If you just click on any of them, you can animate the properties, but I will instead be animating it via a modifier. So I'm going to add now the displacement modifier to this cube, and I'm going to add that texture in. And here is the default configuration, but one really simple thing we can do is start the strength here. As we go in the middle, we will maybe invert that, and then we'll jump to the end again, and we will bring that back into the positive. And so now, in the same way as it's going to be growing, it's going to go and cycle through those displacements really quickly, shrinking in and out, becoming very mobile. We can also try to keyframe some of the values of the textures even. For example, that these different feature weights, we could keyframe and animate, and we could really rapidly generate some interesting behaviors. I'm just randomly keyframing this stuff even. Just going to make this as wild as possible. And this is actually even in the texture itself in this displacement. Obviously, if you go through and preview this more precisely, you could get very specific results in mind. And as with anything, you could always freeze this on any point and say, ooh, I really like that frame, and then you could bake it at that frame. But for sake of example, we'll just leave that as is. You'll find as you go, you can animate a number of different modifiers. Pretty much any modifier you'll find will have their procedural values keyframeable. And I encourage you to experiment some with that. Of course, some of the more obvious types of animation come in the particles and simulations, which hopefully you've played around with a bit already.